The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days in downtown Los Angeles, turning the already grim streets into a maze of puddles and desperation. For Marcus Thompson, a 42-year-old former software engineer who had been living on the streets for 8 months, the weather was just another reminder of how far his life had fallen from the comfortable suburban existence he had once known. Marcus hadn't always been homeless. Just 2 years earlier, he had been earning 6 figures as a senior developer for a tech startup, living in a modest but comfortable apartment in Santa Monica, and planning a future that seemed secure and predictable. But a series of devastating events had stripped away everything he thought he could count on. First, his company had folded during a round of venture capital funding that fell through, leaving him unemployed with stock options that became worthless overnight. Then, his mother had been diagnosed with late-stage cancer, and Marcus had exhausted his savings, paying for experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. When she died 6 months later, the medical debt and his inability to find work in an increasingly competitive tech market had led to eviction, bankruptcy, and eventually, life on the streets. Now, as he huddled under a makeshift shelter constructed from cardboard and plastic sheeting behind a downtown office building, Marcus reflected on the cruel irony of his situation. He possessed skills that companies desperately needed: expertise in cybersecurity, blockchain technology, and financial systems, but his lack of a permanent address, access to regular showers, and appropriate clothing made him essentially unemployable. In the professional world he had once navigated with confidence, the office building where Marcus had set up his temporary shelter was a gleaming 40-story tower that housed various businesses, including several financial services companies, and what appeared to be import-export operations. He had chosen this location because the building's security was surprisingly lax during overnight hours. The loading dock provided some protection from the elements, and the dumpsters behind the building occasionally contained discarded food from the building's cafeteria that was still edible. It was during one of his routine searches for food and useful discarded items that Marcus made the discovery that would change his life forever. On the evening of November 15, 2023, Marcus was investigating a collection of boxes that had been placed near the dumpster area. Unlike the usual office waste paper, broken equipment, and food containers, these boxes appeared to contain personal belongings. As if someone had been forced to clear out an office quickly, the boxes were sealed with heavy tape and marked with what appeared to be Spanish words that Marcus didn't recognize. Driven by curiosity and the desperate hope that the boxers might contain something useful, perhaps clothing, electronics he could sell, or even food markers, carefully opened one of the smaller containers. What he found inside defied his expectations and challenged his understanding of reality. The box contained stacks of cash, not just a few $100s, but thick bundles of $100 bills wrapped in plastic and organized with a precision that suggested professional handling. Marcus's hands trembled as he counted the money in the first bundle, $10,000 in crisp new bills. His initial reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by fear. This amount of money, hidden in unmarked boxes and abandoned behind an office building, could only mean one thing: it was connected to illegal activities. Marcus's knowledge of crime, movies, and news reports told him that this kind of cash was likely connected to drug trafficking, money laundering, or other criminal enterprises. But as he opened additional boxes and discovered more money, of thousands of dollars in total, Marcus faced a moral and practical dilemma that would test every principle he had ever held about right and wrong. Marcus spent the next several hours carefully examining the contents of all 6 boxes. In addition to the cash, he found documents written in Spanish, what appeared to be ledgers with names and numbers, and several cell phones that had been wiped clean. The total amount of money, by his careful count, was approximately $2 million. As dawn approached and the first office workers began arriving at the building, Marcus realized he had to make a decision quickly. He could report the discovery to the police, which would likely result in the money being confiscated as evidence in a criminal investigation, with no guarantee that it would ever be returned to legitimate owners. He could simply walk away and pretend he had never seen the boxers, leaving the money for whoever had originally placed it there or for other scavengers to discover, or he could take the money. The ethical implications of theft weighed heavily on Marcus's conscience, but so did the reality of his situation. He had been living on the streets for 8 months, surviving on charity meals and whatever work he could find. He had watched other homeless individuals die from exposure, overdoses, and violence. He had experienced the daily humiliation of being treated as invisible by a society that had once valued his contributions. More importantly, Marcus reasoned, this money was clearly the proceeds of criminal activity. Taking it wouldn't be stealing from innocent victims, but rather redirecting ill-gotten gains away from people who had acquired it through illegal means. If he could use this money to rebuild his life and perhaps help other people in similar situations, wouldn't that be a more ethical outcome than allowing it to return to criminals? Marcus also recognized that his unique skills and background gave him advantages that other people in his situation wouldn't have. His knowledge of financial systems, technology, and business operations meant that he could potentially launder and legitimize this money in ways that would be impossible for someone without his expertise. After hours of internal debate, made his decision. Working quickly and methodically, he transferred the money from the original boxers into garbage bags and a large duffel bag he had found among the discarded items. He carefully destroyed any documents that might connect the money to its original owners, and he disposed of the cell phones in a way that would make them impossible to trace. By 7 a.m., Marcus had moved all $23 million to a storage unit he rented using fake identification he had acquired during his time on the streets, a skill he had learned from other homeless individuals who had taught him how to navigate systems without leaving paper trails. But taking the money was only the first step in what Marcus knew would be a complex and dangerous process of transformation. Over the next several days, Marcus began implementing a carefully planned strategy to legitimize his newfound wealth without attracting attention from law enforcement or the criminal organizations that had originally owned the money. His first priority was establishing a new identity. Using his technical skills and knowledge of cybersecurity, Marcus created a comprehensive false identity, complete with social security number, credit history, and employment records. He chose the name David Chen, reasoning that an Asian identity would help him blend in more easily in Los Angeles' diverse population. Next, Marcus began the process of slowly introducing the money into the legitimate financial system. He opened multiple bank accounts in different institutions, making initial deposits that were large enough to establish credibility but small enough to avoid triggering federal reporting requirements. He created a series of shell companies and investment accounts that would allow him to move money between different entities while creating the appearance of legitimate business activity. Marcus's background in software development proved invaluable during this process. He created sophisticated digital records that supported his new identity's business activities, including invoices, contracts, and financial statements that would withstand casual scrutiny from banks and government agencies. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus began investing the money in legitimate businesses and real estate that would generate legal income and further distance the funds from their criminal origins. Within 6 weeks of discovering the money, David Chen had purchased a modest apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, acquired appropriate clothing and personal items, and established himself as a freelance technology consultant with a growing portfolio of legitimate clients. The transformation was remarkable, not just in terms of Marcus's external circumstances, but also in terms of his psychological state. For the first time in months, he had hope for the future. He could shower regularly, eat nutritious meals, and sleep in a real bed. He could begin rebuilding the professional relationships and personal connections that homelessness had destroyed. But Marcus also understood that his new life was built on a foundation that was both fragile and dangerous. The criminal organization that had lost $23 million would eventually discover the theft, and they would likely pursue the money with resources and methods that law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't use. Moreover, Marcus knew that his transformation from homeless man to millionaire would attract attention if he wasn't careful about how he presented his success to the world. As he settled into his new apartment on his first night off the streets in 8 months, Marcus reflected on the magnitude of what he had done and what it might mean for his future. He had stolen $23 million from what was almost certainly a dangerous criminal organization, created a new identity, and begun the process of building a legitimate life with illegitimate funds. The money had given him a second chance at life, but it had also made him a target for people who would stop at nothing to recover what they believed was theirs. Marcus understood that his real challenge wasn't just spending the money or enjoying his newfound wealth, it was staying alive long enough to make his transformation permanent and perhaps using his resources to help other people who found themselves in the desperate situation he had escaped. As he drifted off to sleep in his first real bed in months, Marcus carried with him both the satisfaction of having escaped homelessness and the knowledge that his new life would require constant vigilance, careful planning, and perhaps a willingness to make moral compromises that his former self would never have considered. The homeless man who had discovered $23 million in a dumpster was gone forever, but the millionaire who had taken his place would have to navigate challenges that were just as dangerous as life on the streets, albeit in very different ways. 3 months had passed since Marcus Thompson had transformed himself into David Chen, and the metamorphosis had been more successful than he had dared to hope. His new identity was holding up under scrutiny, his money laundering operations were proceeding smoothly, and he had begun to establish himself as a legitimate businessman in Los Angeles' competitive technology sector. David Chen's consulting firm, Pacific Digital Solutions, had quickly gained a reputation for solving complex cybersecurity problems for mid-sized businesses. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that he was using skills he had developed as a homeless man, specifically his ability to navigate systems without leaving traces. to help legitimate businesses protect themselves from the kind of criminal activity that had funded his transformation. His client base was growing steadily, and the income from his legitimate work was beginning to supplement the carefully laundered cartel money, creating a sustainable foundation for his new life. Marcus had purchased a modest but comfortable home in Pasadena, acquired a reliable car, and even begun dating a woman named Sarah, a nurse he had met at a coffee shop near his office. But beneath the surface of his apparently successful new life, Marcus was constantly aware that he was living on borrowed time. The first sign that his theft had been discovered came in the form of a news report that appeared on local television in late February 2024. A reporter was standing outside the same office building where Marcus had found the money, describing a federal investigation into money laundering operations connected to the Sinaloa cartel. Federal agents raided offices in this downtown building last week, the reporter explained, as part of an ongoing investigation into a sophisticated money laundering network that authorities believe was moving millions of dollars in drug proceeds through seemingly legitimate businesses. Marcus felt his blood run cold as he watched the report. The timing couldn't be coincidental. The investigation had clearly been triggered by the discovery that $23 million had gone missing from the cartel's operations. Sources close to the investigation tell us that the missing money may have been stolen by someone with inside knowledge of the organization's operations. The reporter continued, federal agents are pursuing multiple leads and have indicated that they believe the theft was carried out by someone with sophisticated technical skills. Over the following weeks, Marcus noticed subtle signs that he was being watched. Cars that appeared outside his home at unusual hours, the same faces appearing in different locations where he conducted business, and an increase in what seemed like casual questions from new acquaintances about his background and business activities. Marcus's paranoia was confirmed when he discovered that someone had attempted to hack into his computer systems. His cybersecurity expertise allowed him to detect the intrusion and trace it back to what appeared to be a professional surveillance operation. The hackers were better than typical law enforcement, which suggested that the cartel had hired private investigators or criminal hackers to track down their missing money. Realizing that his carefully constructed new identity was under threat, Marcus began implementing more sophisticated countermeasures. He upgraded his home security system, varied his daily routines to make surveillance more difficult, and began using encrypted communication methods for all his business activities. But Marcus also understood that purely defensive measures wouldn't be enough to protect him long term. If the cartel was actively searching for their missing money, they would eventually trace it back to him, unless he took more aggressive action to throw them off his trail. It was during this period of increased danger that Marcus made a decision that would fundamentally change the nature of his relationship with the criminal underworld. He decided to go on the offensive. Using his technical skills and the resources that his stolen millions had provided, Marcus began conducting his own investigation into the cartel's operations. He reasoned that if he could gather enough information about their activities, he might be able to use it as leverage to protect himself, or alternatively, provide it to law enforcement in a way that would neutralize the threat without exposing his own role in the theft. Marcus's investigation revealed that the money he had stolen was just a small part of a much larger operation. The Sinaloa cartel was using a network of legitimate businesses in Los Angeles to launder hundreds of millions of dollars in drug proceeds. The operation involved real estate companies, import-export businesses, restaurants, and even several technology firms that were unknowingly processing payments for criminal enterprises. More importantly, Marcus discovered that the cartel's local operations were managed by a man named Eduardo Vasquez, a Mexican-American businessman who had built a reputation as a successful entrepreneur while secretly coordinating money laundering activities for the cartel. Vasquez operated out of a legitimate business complex in downtown Los Angeles, and his public profile was that of a philanthropist and community leader who supported various charitable causes. But Marcus's investigation revealed that Vasquez was personally responsible for moving more than $50 million in cartel money through Los Angeles each month. Armed with this information, Marcus began developing a plan that was both audacious and dangerous. He would expose Vasquez's operations to federal authorities while simultaneously positioning himself as a valuable asset in the investigation. Marcus's plan required him to take enormous risks, but he reasoned that his current situation was unsustainable. The cartel would eventually find him, and when they did, they would likely torture and kill him to recover their money and send a message to other potential thieves. His only chance of long-term survival was to eliminate the threat entirely, using anonymous communication methods. Marcus began providing information about Vasquez's operations to the FBI. He was careful to present the information in a way that suggested it came from someone with inside knowledge of the cartel's activities, but without revealing his own identity or connection to the missing $23 million. The information Marcus provided was incredibly valuable to federal investigators. It included detailed financial records, communication, intercepts, and evidence of specific money laundering transactions that would have taken law enforcement months or years to develop through traditional investigative methods. within 6 weeks of Marcus's first contact with the FBI. Federal agents had gathered enough evidence to obtain warrants for a massive raid on Vasquez's operations. The raid, which took place on a Tuesday morning in April 2024, resulted in the arrest of Vasquez and 17 other individuals connected to the cartel's Los Angeles operations, but Marcus's plan had a second phase that was even more dangerous than the first. During the chaos of the federal raid, Marcus used his access to the cartel's computer systems access he had gained through his investigation to steal an additional $12 million from accounts that Vasquez had been using to store cartel funds. This second theft was much more sophisticated than his original discovery of the abandoned money. Marcus used his cybersecurity expertise to transfer the funds through a complex series of international accounts before bringing the money back into the United States through cryptocurrency exchanges and offshore investment vehicles. The beauty of this second theft was that it would be attributed to the federal investigation rather than to a separate criminal actor. When the cartel discovered that $12 million had disappeared during the raid, they would assume that it had been seized by law enforcement along with the other assets that were confiscated. By the time the dust settled from the federal operation, Marcus had successfully eliminated the primary threat to his safety while simultaneously increasing his stolen wealth from $25 million. But Marcus's success came with new complications that he hadn't fully anticipated. The federal investigation into the cartel's operations had been so successful that the FBI began looking for the source of their anonymous tips. While Marcus had been careful to hide his identity, federal investigators were sophisticated enough to recognize that their informant possessed inside knowledge that suggested either current or former involvement with the cartel's operations. Moreover, the cartel's response to the loss of their Los Angeles operations was swift and brutal. Within days of Vasquez's arrest, several individuals who had been connected to the money laundering network were found dead, apparently killed as punishment for the security breach that had led to the federal raid. Marcus realized that while he had successfully eliminated the immediate threat to his safety, he had also escalated his conflict with the cartel to a level where the stakes were much higher. If they ever discovered his role in providing information to federal authorities, they would view him not just as a thief, but as a traitor who had cost them millions of dollars and resulted in the imprisonment of key personnel. The pressure of living with this knowledge began to affect Marcus in ways he hadn't expected. Despite his financial success and the apparent security of his new identity, he found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, analyzing every interaction for signs of surveillance or threat. His relationship with Sarah, the nurse he had been dating, began to suffer as Marcus became increasingly secretive about his background and paranoid about potential threats. He couldn't explain to her why he was so concerned about security, why he insisted on varying their routines, or why he sometimes disappeared for days at a time to handle business matters that he couldn't discuss. Sarah said to him, during what would turn out to be their last dinner together, "I care about you, but I feel like I don't really know you. You're secretive about your past. You're paranoid about things that don't seem threatening to me. And sometimes I feel like you're living a completely different life that you can't or won't share with me." Marcus wanted to tell her the truth that he was living a different life, that his paranoia was justified, and that his secrecy was necessary to protect both of them. But he also knew that involving Sarah in his situation would put her in danger, and potentially compromise the security he had worked so hard to establish. "I understand," he told her, "and I'm sorry. You deserve someone who can be completely honest with you, and I can't be that person right now." As Marcus watched Sarah walk out of his life, he reflected on the true cost of his transformation from homeless man to millionaire. He had gained financial security and material comfort, but he had lost the ability to form genuine relationships or live without constant fear. But Marcus also understood that there was no going back. He had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, made enemies who wouldn't forgive, and committed crimes that would follow him for the rest of his life. His only option was to continue moving forward, using his wealth and skills to stay ahead of the threats that pursued him, while trying to find some way to build a meaningful life within the constraints of his dangerous new reality. As he sat alone in his comfortable home, surrounded by the material evidence of his success but isolated from genuine human connection, Marcus wondered whether he had truly escaped homelessness or simply traded one form of desperation for another. 2 years had passed since Marcus Thompson had stolen $23 million from the Sinaloa cartel and transformed himself into David Chen, successful technology entrepreneur. By any external measure, his reinvention had been a complete success. Pacific Digital Solutions had grown into a thriving cybersecurity firm with 35 employees and contracts with major corporations throughout California. His personal wealth, carefully laundered and legitimized through various investment vehicles, had grown to over $50 million. David Chen had become everything that Marcus Thompson had once aspired to be: wealthy, respected, and influential. In his field, he owned a beautiful home in an exclusive Pasadena neighborhood, drove luxury cars, and was frequently invited to speak at technology conferences and business events. He had even established a charitable foundation that provided technology training and job placement services for homeless individuals, a cause that was deeply personal to him, though no one understood why. But success had come with a price that Marcus was only beginning to fully understand. The constant vigilance required to maintain his false identity and protect himself from cartel retaliation had taken a psychological toll that money couldn't heal. Marcus had become a master of compartmentalization, able to function effectively in business and social situations while constantly monitoring his environment for threats and maintaining multiple contingency plans for escape or defense. His home was equipped with military-grade security systems. His vehicles were armored, and he employed a private security firm staffed by former Special Forces operators to provide discreet protection during his daily activities. To outside observers, these precautions seemed like the reasonable security measures of a successful businessman, but Marcus knew they were the desperate defenses of a man living under constant threat. The isolation that came with his secret had become perhaps the most difficult aspect of his new life. Marcus had learned that wealth without genuine human connection was a hollow achievement. He had attempted several relationships over the past 2 years, but each had ended when his inability to be completely honest about his past created insurmountable barriers to intimacy. David, his most recent girlfriend, Jennifer, had said during their breakup conversation, "You're successful, intelligent, and generous. But there's something about you that feels ... unreachable. It's like you're always holding back some essential part of yourself." She was right, of course. Marcus was holding back the most essential part of himself, the truth about who he really was and how he had acquired his wealth. But revealing that truth would not only end any relationship, it would likely result in his imprisonment or death. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that his charitable work with homeless individuals had become both his greatest source of satisfaction and his most painful reminder of what he had lost. Through his foundation, he had helped hundreds of people transition from homelessness to stable housing and employment. He had seen firsthand how his resources could transform lives and provide hope to people who had been abandoned by society. But every success story reminded him of the community he had left behind when he stole the cartel money. The homeless individuals he now helped saw him as a successful businessman who had chosen to give back to society, not as someone who had once shared their struggles and understood their desperation from personal experience. Marcus's sense of isolation was compounded by his growing awareness that his criminal activities had consequences that extended far beyond his own situation. The federal investigation that he had triggered by providing information about Eduardo Vasquez had resulted in the imprisonment of dozens of individuals, some of whom were low-level employees who had been unaware of the criminal nature of their work. Moreover, the disruption of the cartel's Los Angeles operations had led to a violent power struggle as competing organizations attempted to fill the vacuum left by the Sinaloa cartel's reduced presence. Marcus read news reports of drug-related violence with the knowledge that his actions had contributed to the chaos. Even if his intentions had been purely self-protective, the weight of these moral complexities had led Marcus to seek guidance from an unexpected source. Father Miguel Santos, a Catholic priest who worked with homeless populations in downtown Los Angeles. Marcus had met Father Santos through his charitable work, and he had been impressed by the priest's practical approach to helping people in desperate situations. Unlike many religious leaders who focus primarily on spiritual salvation, Father Santos understood that people needed food, shelter, and medical care before they could address deeper questions about meaning and purpose. "Father," Marcus had said during one of their conversations, "what do you do when you've made choices that have helped some people but harmed others? When the good you've accomplished is built on actions that were morally questionable?" Father Santos had studied Marcus carefully before responding. "David, I've worked with people in desperate situations for 20 years. I've seen individuals make choices that they never thought they would make, simply to survive. The question isn't whether those choices were perfect hits, what you do with the consequences. But what if the consequences include ongoing harm to other people?" Marcus had pressed. "Then you have a responsibility to minimize that harm and maximize the good that can come from your situation." Father Santos had replied, "Guilt and self-recrimination don't help anyone. Action and commitment to doing better in the future do." This conversation had planted the seed of an idea that would ultimately lead Marcus to make the most dangerous decision of his new life. Marcus began to consider the possibility of using his wealth and position to actively combat the criminal organizations that he had once stolen from. His cybersecurity expertise, combined with his understanding of money laundering operations, made him uniquely qualified to disrupt cartel activities in ways that traditional law enforcement couldn't. The plan that Marcus developed was ambitious and incredibly risky. He would use his technology firm as a front to infiltrate the computer systems of various criminal organizations, gathering intelligence that could be provided to law enforcement while simultaneously disrupting their operations through cyber attacks. But Marcus's plan went beyond simple information gathering. He intended to steal money from criminal organizations and redirect it to legitimate charitable causes. essentially becoming a digital Robin Hood who used his technical skills to transfer wealth from criminals to people in need. The first target Marcus selected was a human trafficking network that was using cryptocurrency to move money between the United States and Eastern Europe. Using sophisticated hacking techniques, Marcus was able to trace the network's financial transactions and identify the digital wallets where they stored their profits. Over the course of several weeks, Marcus systematically drained the trafficking network's accounts, stealing approximately $8 million that he then donated anonymously to organizations that provided services to trafficking victims. The beauty of the operation was that the criminals couldn't report the theft to law enforcement without exposing their own illegal activities. But Marcus's cyber-vigilante activities attracted attention from unexpected sources. Mr. Chen said, Agent Sarah Martinez of the FBI's Cybercrime Division during a meeting that Marcus had not requested or anticipated, "We'd like to discuss some unusual patterns in cybercriminal activity that seem to be connected to your area of expertise." Marcus felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble as Agent Martinez described a series of cyber attacks against criminal organizations that demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of both cybersecurity and money laundering operations. "We're not suggesting that you're involved in these activities," Agent Martinez continued, "but we're hoping that your expertise might help us understand how someone could be carrying out these operations and whether they represent a threat to national security." Marcus realized that his cyber-vigilante activities had been more visible than he had intended. The FBI had noticed the pattern of attacks against criminal organizations and were trying to identify the perpetrator. While they didn't yet suspect him specifically, their investigation was moving in directions that could eventually expose his activities. "I'd be happy to help however I can," Marcus replied, knowing that cooperation was his best chance of deflecting suspicion while gathering information about the FBI's investigation. Over the following months, Marcus found himself in the surreal the position of consulting with federal law enforcement about his own criminal activities. His expertise was genuinely valuable to the FBI's investigation, and his cooperation helped them understand the technical aspects of the cyber attacks they were investigating. But Marcus also used his position as a consultant to monitor the progress of the investigation and ensured that it didn't move in directions that would expose his own role in the activities they were studying. The psychological strain of this double-life successful businessman, cyber vigilante, and FBI consultant began to take a toll that Marcus hadn't anticipated. He was simultaneously fighting criminal organizations, helping law enforcement, and concealing his own criminal past, all while maintaining the facade of a legitimate technology entrepreneur. The breaking point came when Marcus discovered that his cyber vigilante activities had attracted the attention of the same cartel from which he had originally stolen $23 million. Intelligence gathered through his FBI consulting work revealed that the Sinaloa cartel had hired a team of professional hackers to identify and eliminate the person who had been attacking criminal organizations' computer systems. The cartel had connected the cyber acts to the earlier theft of their money and were now actively hunting for Marcus. Though they still didn't know his current identity, Marcus realized that his attempts to use his wealth and skills for good had ultimately made his situation more dangerous than ever. He was now being pursued by multiple criminal organizations, investigated by federal law enforcement, and living under an identity that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Marcus also understood that he had reached a point where a retreat was no longer possible. He had committed himself to a path that required him to either succeed completely or face consequences that would likely be fatal. In a final, desperate gambit, Marcus decided to reveal his true identity to Agent Martinez and offered to become an official FBI informant in exchange for protection and immunity from prosecution for his past crimes. "Agent Martinez," he said during what he knew would be their most important conversation, "I have information about the cyber acts you've been investigating, but before I share it, I need to discuss terms for my cooperation and protection." As Marcus prepared to reveal the truth about his transformation from homeless man to millionaire cyber vigilante, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had stolen millions of dollars, created a false identity, built a successful business, helped hundreds of people escape homelessness, and fought against criminal organizations using methods that were themselves criminal. Whether his story would end in redemption or destruction remained to be seen. But Marcus knew that he had chosen a path that was consistent with the values he had developed during his time on the streets. That desperate situations sometimes require desperate measures, and that the true measure of a person's character is what they do with the power they acquire, regardless of how they acquired it. The homeless man who had discovered $23 million in a dumpster was gone forever, but the legacy of his choices would continue to shape the lives of countless people, for better or worse, long after his own story reached its conclusion. Legal disclaimer: this story is completely fictional and was created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The story does not endorse or encourage illegal activities such as theft, money laundering, or